There are moments so raw, so jarring that if you stood there yourself, your heart would stop. And one question would burn in your mind. If it were me, would I step forward or would I walk away? Imagine this deep in the mountains. You check a snare you set the day before, expecting nothing more than a rabbit or a fox. Instead, you see a person. Not just any person. A young woman, her ankle bleeding, breath-ragged eyes wide with terror, staring at you as if her entire life depends on the choice you make in the next second. What would you do? Stand and watch, turn your back, or cut the rope and carry her away, knowing that choice might alter the rest of your life forever. Before we step into this story, let me ask you if you find yourself drawn to tales of harsh landscapes, chance encounters, and the kind of bonds forged through pain, frost, and redemption. Make sure you follow this channel. That way you won't miss what comes next. And drop a comment below. What would you do if you were Wade Coulter? In that moment, your voice might just breathe new life into the story itself. New Mexico Territory, October 1881. That morning came hard, brutal with cold. No sun yet over the ridge. Frost clung white to every blade of grass, turning the meadow edge into a field of knives. Wade Coulter rose stiff from his bedroll, the old pain in his knee, reminding him it had never healed right since the war. He pulled on his heavy coat-fed pine sticks into the stove and stirred the coals until they glowed faint red again. Pain was no stranger to him. Neither was solitude. For 3 winters, Wade had lived alone in a log cabin near the tree line, half a day's ride from the nearest town. He had walked away from the army after Thomas, his younger brother, was gunned down in a battle that meant nothing in the end. Wade wanted no more orders, no more men, no more graves. He chose exile in the mountains, a life stripped down to wood traps and silence. That morning, he strapped on his old cavalry knife, slung the rifle across his shoulder, and walked the snare line east of the ravine. His breath smoked white in the air. Each step cracked frost beneath his boots. He expected little, maybe a rabbit or two, enough to smoke and hang. But at the 5th snare, he froze. Something was wrong. The noise behind the brush wasn't coyote, wasn't squirrel. It was the sound of someone fighting for air. Wade pushed through the branches and stopped cold. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman. Apache. She lay twisted in the dirt, her ankle caught in the loop of his snare, bleeding where the rope had cut deep. Mud streaked her skin, blood dried against her ribs. Her hair long and dark, tangled with leaves. The deerskin dress clinging to her frame was torn and hanging, exposing shoulder thigh and bruises that told of days running hard from something, maybe bounty men, maybe her own people. Her whole body shook. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes locked on his with a panic so sharp it cut deeper than the frost. In her hand she clutched a rock arm, trembling as if she meant to throw it. The stone was small, dull. Her grip was weak, but the fury in her stare said she would fight until she had nothing left. Wade didn't raise his rifle. He didn't speak. He just crouched slow and steady and drew his knife. Her breath ripped into a shriek, low and broken, as if certain the blade was meant for her throat. But Wade turned the steel down, pressed it to the rope, and sawed through clean. The tension snapped free. Blood rushed from her ankle, and she sagged, trying to crawl, but too spent. The rock slipped from her fingers. She collapsed. For a long moment, Wade just stood there. He could leave. He could let wolves find her by nightfall. No one would ever know. No one would blame him. But as he looked down at the ruined ankle, the bruises along her ribs, the raw defiance still burning in her gaze, despite the pain, he knew the truth. She would not last the night. And that was something Wade Coulter could not walk away from. He bent low, lifted her into his arms. She struggled weakly, fists pressing against his chest, but she had no fight left. She was warm in some places, cold as ice in others. He felt the weight of her heavier than she looked, built strong in the hips and thighs, despite her suffering. Her breath hit his shoulder, not unconscious but past resistance. The trek back to the cabin was long. His knee ached with every step, but he kept walking. With each mile, the sound of her shallow breathing marked the rhythm of a choice he hadn't meant to make. By the time he reached the door, nudged it open with his shoulder and carried her inside, he knew there was no going back. The cabin, once nothing but wood fire and silence, now held something else, a stranger bleeding and afraid, who had fallen into his life as suddenly as a bullet through the dark. And for Wade Coulter, a man who thought he had chosen loneliness forever, that shock cut deeper than any old wound. Inside the small log cabin, tucked deep in the pines, the heat from the stove began to spread, but it couldn't push away the tension that thickened the air. The Apache woman Wade had carried in her name, Sana lay on the rough cot under a wool blanket. Her dark eyes never left him, following every movement, as if the smallest gesture could turn into a threat. Wade knew that look. He had seen it in the faces of young soldiers taken prisoner and men who no longer trusted human kindness after witnessing too much brutality. It was the look of someone cornered, armed only with suspicion and the will to survive. He stirred water over the fire. The logs cracked and hissed pine sap burning sharp in the air. When the steam rose, he tore strips of clean cloth, soaked them, and carried the basin to the cot. Sana shrank back, fists tightening around the blanket, eyes flashing like a trapped animal ready to bite. "This is going to sting," Wade said. His voice was low, steady. Even if she didn't understand all the words, maybe she would hear the calm behind them. The wet cloth touched her ankle. She jerked hard breath, hissing between clenched teeth. A low cry escaped her throat, half anger, half pain. She gripped the bedpost with shaking arms while he wrapped the wound. Wade kept his gaze fixed on her foot, refusing to let his eyes wander to the bruises scattered across her ribs and arms. Those marks hadn't come from his trap alone. They were old, layered, carved into her by days of flight and violence. For a moment, anger stirred in him, not at her, but at whoever had done this. He swallowed it down and finished the bandage, tying the linen snug to stop the bleeding. Then he stepped back, careful not to crowd her. He ladled a bowl of stew from the pot, set it on the stool beside the cot, and retreated to his chair by the fire. Sana stared at the food, her lips dry, her eyes bright with hunger. But her hand didn't move. She waited, wary, watching him as if she expected a trick, a blow, or poison hidden in the broth. He didn't urge her. He didn't speak again. He just sat there, poking at the fire now and then. Only when his attention seemed elsewhere did she reach for the spoon slowly, as if expecting him to stop her. He didn't. The first bite vanished into her mouth. She froze, waiting. Nothing happened. So she ate again, bite after bite, until the bowl was scraped clean. She set it down quietly, eyes still on him. He hadn't moved closer, hadn't spoken a word. That silence, strange as it was the only proof she had that he meant her no harm. That night she did not sleep. Wade lay on the floor across the room, wrapped in his old army blanket. He listened to her breathing shift fast, shallow, uneven. He heard the rustle of fabric when she sat up, the soft thump as she lay back down again. Fear kept her awake, and Wade stayed half awake himself, not to guard against her, but to make sure she wasn't left alone in her terror. Morning light crept pale through the cracks in the shutters. Wade rose, stiff-fed wood into the stove. When he turned, her eyes were already on him, sharp, watchful, as though she'd been waiting for him to make a wrong move. He spoke finally, his voice rough from disuse. "You understand?" English silence stretched, then a small, careful nod. Her lips parted dry and cracked, but her voice came low and steady. Yes. It was the first word she'd spoken. Hoarse, fragile, but resolute. And in that single word, Wade understood her silence before had not been ignorance, it had been choice. Trust, if it could be called, that had begun in the smallest of ways. A bowl of stew eaten clean. A whisper of acknowledgement. A nod. Nothing more. But for Wade, who had lived 3 winters in silence, it was enough to feel the cabin had changed. He didn't know her story. She didn't know his. What bound them was something far more primitive she hadn't run, and he hadn't left. Sana still feared him. She still doubted everything in front of her. But she stayed. And Wade, sitting in the firelight, realized that sometimes trust doesn't come through grand promises. Sometimes it comes through the simplest truth: you didn't walk away. The third night in the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the rough log walls, shadows shifting like old scars. Sana sat against the wall, knees drawn up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders unnoticed, her dark eyes fixed on the coals, as if searching for a doorway out of the present. Wade sat across from her chair, tilted back near the stove, turning a tin cup of coffee in slow circles. Neither of them spoke until her voice broke the silence, thin and cracked like ice splitting on a river. "They cast me out." Wade looked up. He hadn't asked about her past, never pushed. But this time her eyes held on his, as though daring him to listen, to judge, or to turn away. "I was born after a drought," Sana said each word, dropping heavy like stones into a canyon. "That year the creek dried. The crops failed. Then my sister died from fever. The elder said I carried bad luck, that I was cursed. Every misfortune, every sickness, every death, they pinned it on me." She let out a bitter laugh, empty of joy. "Weddings, harvests, deaths, it didn't matter. They said I brought ruin. When my mother died, they had no reason left to keep me. No man would marry me. No one would even stand close. A wolf could still stay with the pack. But not me." Wade didn't interrupt. He heard the rasp in her voice, the tight grind of her teeth, the sharp inhale she tried to swallow down like it might choke her. He knew what it meant to be cut off from a world you once thought you belonged to. He turned the cup in his hand, then answered softly, "They were wrong." Her gaze flared fierce as fire. "You weren't there. You didn't see the way they looked at me. You didn't see me standing outside the fire circle like a ghost." Wade set the cup aside. Memories rose, unbidden smoke gunfire, and the blurred face of Thomas, his younger brother, falling in the chaos. He drew a breath, slow and jagged. "I lost my brother. 17. Too young. He volunteered anyway. I went to keep him safe. Thought I could. I couldn't." His hand rubbed unconsciously over the pale scar at his wrist, a relic of that day. One bullet. That was all it took. I came back with an empty pack and a name carved on a stone. After that, I didn't see any place that wanted me either. So I left. I chose solitude. The fire snapped, sending sparks up the chimney. For a long time they both stared at the embers, each seeing something else. Graves, shadows, things lost forever. "You walked away," Sana whispered. "I was left behind." Different roads, but both led to the same barren ground of loneliness. Wade's voice dropped, heavy but steady. "You're not cursed. Drought, sickness, death, they happen to everyone. That wasn't you. Tell that to them," she said. "I don't need to," Wade replied. "I'm telling you." For the first time her eyes softened. The suspicion that had armored every glance eased just a little. Something fragile glimmered between them. Thin, faint, but real. After a moment she tugged the blanket up over her shoulder. "You're not afraid I'll bring misfortune to you?" Wade let out a dry, crooked laugh, rough as burning wood. "I've had my share already. One more won't matter. But I know one thing sitting here with you. I feel less alone." The words didn't land as comfort, but as truth. Sana turned her face away, lips pressed tight, though her lashes trembled. She clutched the blanket closer, not to guard against him this time, but to hold on to the warmth that had slipped in. That night they still slept on opposite sides of the cabin, he on the floor, she on the cot. But the silence wasn't as cold. It carried steady breaths, a little calmer, and the quiet knowledge that two people cast out by the world had for the first time heard an echo of themselves in someone else. Winter on the high ridge was never kind. Wind cut through the pines, howling against the cabin roof like lost spirits. Snow swallowed the ground, covering the trails Wade had once known by heart. Yet inside the small log walls, for the first time in years, the air wasn't just silence and cold. Days passed, and Sana began to slip into the rhythm of life there. In the mornings, when Wade built the fire, She helped clean the basin or gathered kindling. Her hands were slim but strong, practiced from labor, not clumsy as he might have guessed. When Wade returned from the traps with pelts, Sana sat nearby scraping them with a steady hand, dark eyes fixed on the work. In each movement, he saw a strength beneath her worn frame, a will that refused to bend. One noon, after the snow eased, Wade pulled a stool onto the porch to sharpen his axe. Sana followed, limping still but insistent on trying. At first he refused, but her stare was firm, unyielding. "I am not a burden." He handed her the lighter handle. The first swings went wide, the blade glancing off. She tightened her jaw, tried again, and this time the axe bit clean through the log. She looked up briefly, not boastful, not seeking praise, only reclaiming dignity. That evening, over rabbit stew and flatbread, Wade noticed she no longer watched him with the sharp, guarded suspicion of the first nights. Her gaze was quieter now, less afraid. And he too saw something new, not a wounded outcast, but someone resilient enough to face down a winter storm. Later, by the fire's dim glow, she asked suddenly, "You never ask where I'll go, when I can walk again." Wade paused, then answered, "No need. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But I won't see you off either. Stay or go, that's yours to decide." Sana said nothing, but her lips pressed into a line as if holding back words. That night her breathing came steadier, no longer broken by startled gasps. The next day she folded Wade's washed clothes, laying them by the fire to dry. He froze a moment at the sight. No one had touched his belongings since Thomas died. There'd been no one left to. Yet now, without agreement, without question, the distance inside the cabin had shortened on its own. When another storm rolled through, Wade prepared to check the traps. Sana stood by the door, offering him an old scarf. "It's colder out there," she murmured. Her voice was still rough, but not hard. Wade took it with a nod, saying nothing. Somehow the gesture warmed him more than the stove. On a rare morning of weak sunlight, Sana stepped out onto the porch, her bandaged leg steadying without his shoulder to lean on. Her breath rose in white clouds as she stared at the endless snow. "I never thought I'd survive this far," she whispered. Wade stood beside her, hands buried in his coat pockets. He didn't pry, didn't press into the ache behind her words. He only said, "Yet you're still here." She turned her head toward him. For the first time, there was something in her eyes beyond fear, something fragile, but unmistakable. Hope. From that day, the cabin no longer felt like a hermit's shelter. It had become a place where two abandoned souls leaned quietly toward one another. In the smallest of moments, when Sana laughed softly at splitting wood clean, when she set a bowl of food in front of him without flinching, Wade knew something had taken root. Trust had begun to grow. As winter days dragged on, the snow on the cabin roof began to drip in thin lines of water. For a moment it seemed life had slowed into a fragile peace, but the world outside never let anyone hide for long. Rumors of an Apache woman spotted near the ridge began to drift into town, and in a country like this, rumors rarely came without danger. Wade, a man of few words, seldom rode down from the mountains, but he knew he couldn't stay shut away forever. Supplies were thinning, saltflower coffee barely enough to last the week. One morning he pulled on his coat, saddled the mule. Sana stood in the doorway, lips pressed tight. If they ask, her voice was hoarse-strained, as if pulled from the cold air itself. Wade cinched the strap and answered flatly, "I'll tell them there's no one here." Her eyes darkened, heavy with dread. "They'll know. Someone like me. They'll always see." "I'll handle it," Wade said. His tone didn't rise, but the certainty in it stopped her questions. By midday, he rode into Valero, a muddy strip of buildings, 2 saloons, a church, 1 general store. He moved quickly through the shelves, flour, sugar, coffee, soap, but eyes followed him, measuring, guessing. Ezra Kane, the shopkeeper, leaned close when he laid the goods on the counter. "Word going around," Ezra murmured. "Folks say they found small prints up that way. Not animal." Wade didn't blink. "Coyotes." Ezra shook his head. "Coyotes don't wear soft moccasins." His gaze held firm. Careful, Coulter. There's a bounty hunter sniffing around. He doesn't care about the law, only the pay. Wade gave a slow nod, paid, and left. The trail home stretched longer than usual shadows, pressing close, as if something followed just out of sight. When he stepped back into the cabin, Sana was still by the fire. She rose quickly, reading the tightness in his face. What did they say? Nothing worth hearing. Wade set down the sack, though his hand stayed near the knife at his belt. That night, the wind cut sharp, rattling the shutters. Sana sat silent, staring at the flames, her hands clasped together so tightly, her knuckles whitened. "I've brought danger to you," she whispered. No, Wade answered steady. "Danger was always here. I'm used to it." His words didn't erase the fear, but in Sana's eyes a flicker of gratitude appeared. The next morning, before the light reached the ridge, 3 hard knocks shook the door. Wade froze, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. Sana backed into the corner, blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. "Wade Coulter," a calm voice called. "Roland Tate, Sheriff of Valero. Got a few questions." Wade cracked the door. The man outside was broad-shouldered, late 40s, gray coat, a silver star pinned to his chest. Behind him, a horse blew steam into the cold. Tate's eyes swept past Wade into the cabin. "Word is, an Apache woman's been seen around here. You know anything about that?" Sana's heartbeat thundered in her chest. Her legs refused to move, breath caught sharp in her throat. Wade filled the doorway, his voice flat. "No one here but me." The sheriff's gaze lingered. He noted the second bowl on the table, the blanket by the hearth. Silence pressed heavy between them. Finally, Tate nodded. "Watch yourself. There's a hunter sniffing close. He won't knock, and he won't ask." With that, the sheriff mounted and rode off. Sana exhaled, but her body trembled still. Wade shut the door and dropped the bolt. He crossed the room and sat beside her. "You're not afraid?" Her voice shook. "I am Wade," said, looking at her directly. "But not of them. I'm only afraid you'll think you're alone." Fear didn't vanish with those words. That night, Sana sat by the window long after dark, staring at the snow outside. Every shift of branches made her flinch. Yet in the small cabin with the fire burning and Wade refusing to turn her over, one truth held steady. Even in the weight of fear, the fragile flame of trust had not gone out. The sky hung gray, the wind driving hard down off the ridge. Wade had felt it coming since dawn, something wrong, something shifting in the air. Even the crows had scattered from the treetops, leaving the woods heavy and still. Sana sensed it too. Her eyes hadn't left the window all morning. Both knew the fragile piece they'd carved out was about to be torn apart. By midday, Wade spotted a dust trail crawling along the lower ridge. A lone rider straight-backed his horse, moving steady. Not lost, not wandering, coming with purpose. Wade closed the shutters, dropped the bolts. Sana was already pressed against the corner, clutching the blanket. Her face pale, but eyes sharp with dread. The knock rattled the door. Not 3 patient raps like Sheriff Tate days before, but pounding heavy as if to break it down. "Coulter," a rough, mocking voice. "Name's Hanley. I hear you've got something of mine." Wade's hand brushed the rifle as he cracked the door. The man on the porch wore a long black coat, polished boots, a gleaming revolver at his hip. His face was narrow mustache, thin and sharp. No badge. He didn't need one. The kind of man who traded in lives. "I don't have anything of yours," Wade said flatly. Hanley sneered, stepping closer. "An Apache girl. Dark hair, lean build. She slipped my rope, ran off with what didn't belong to her. I've come to take her back." Behind Wade, Sana gripped the old shotgun, her voice cutting through, raw but steady. "You lie. I had nothing but wounds. You sold me like stock and tied me down to wait for a buyer. When no one came, you thought you could keep me until I broke." Hanley laughed, dry as gravel. "You were bought fair. That makes you property. And property gets returned." Wade moved square in the doorway, blocking his view. "She's not yours. She's not anyone's. Not now. Not ever." Hanley's smile thinned, his eyes darkening. "You'd risk your neck over a squaw. You'll die for nothing." The air tightened. Hanley's hand slid toward his gun. Wade saw every twitch, every breath. Sana's pulse thundered in the cabin. The moment stretched thick as ice about to crack. The shot split the silence. Hanley's pistol barely cleared leather before Wade's rifle spoke. The bullet tore through his chest, flinging him backward off the porch. He hit the frozen ground, hard revolver skittering away across the snow. Smoke curled from Wade's barrel, the echo rolling out into the trees. Then silence. Wade stepped down from the porch, eyes fixed on the crumpled body. Hanley gasped once, twice, then stilled. Sana came out behind him, breathing uneven, her hands trembling. She crouched, picked up the revolver, and with practiced fingers emptied the chamber. The cartridges scattered in the snow before she flung the weapon aside. It was over. They buried him at the ridge's edge, beneath a stand of pines where the earth cut steep. No words spoken, no marker left, just a mound of cold dirt pressed into the silence. Back inside, Wade stripped off his coat, setting the rifle against the wall. Sana still stood near the hearth, her face pale, but her eyes holding his. Her voice was low, steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "You killed for me." Wade shook his head. "No, I killed so he couldn't take what wasn't his. I killed because he tried to take what's mine." The words hung heavy, final, undeniable. The cabin fell into silence again, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was something chosen, sealed in blood. Wade had thrown his lot in with hers, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because he had decided. And Sana understood. No one had ever chosen her before, until now. The death of Hanley left behind a silence, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of something decided, sealed. The old log cabin, once only a shelter from the cold, now carried a heavier meaning. It had become the witness to a choice paid for in blood. Wade was no longer just a hermit offering pity, and Sana was no longer the frightened woman huddled in the corner. From that moment on, they stood on the same side. That night after burying Hanley, the wind tore through the pines, carrying a sharp bite across the ridge. Sana sat near the fire, her face lit by its amber glow, still trembling faintly from the violence, but holding steady. Wade sat across from her, a tin cup turning in his hands untouched. They met each other's eyes without a word. Something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. Sana slowly set down her bowl rose and crossed the floor. Bare footsteps creaked against the wood until she stood beside him. She knelt, her fingers brushing across the calloused back of his hand. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she whispered. Her voice shook, but not from fear. Wade held her gaze. "Are you sure?" She nodded once, firm. When he lifted the blanket, it wasn't with urgency or demand. It was simply two people reaching for each other after too long in the dark. Sana rested her head against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck, while Wade's hand lay lightly across her back, not pulling, only holding, as if to say, "I'm here." In that stillness, the cabin's walls, once echoing only with wind and crackling wood, now held the rhythm of two heartbeats. No vows, no preacher, no ceremony. Just warmth and the unspoken promise that neither would have to face the night alone again. In the days that followed, the cabin took on a new rhythm. At dawn, Sana stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee Wade had poured for her. He went to mend the roof of the lean-to, and when he returned, she was sweeping the floor, lips pressed in quiet concentration. When they broke bread together at the table, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It carried an undercurrent of understanding. One afternoon, Wade split wood outside while Sana sat close by, stitching a tear in his shirt with coarse thread. Each pass of the needle was her way of claiming her place in that home. Wade glanced over, saw her hands working steady, then caught her eyes for a brief moment. He said nothing, only nodded, but that nod was full of recognition. At night, she no longer retreated to the cot by the wall. She sat beside Wade, sharing his blanket by the fire. Words were few, but gestures spoke, her hand finding his in the dark, the quiet lean of her shoulder against his arm, the look they shared that needed no translation. Sana began to tell more of her past nights by the tribal fire, her mother's songs, the emptiness after being cast out. Wade listened without interruption, letting her voice fill the room. When she faltered, he didn't press, only let the silence hold her. In turn, he told her of Thomas, of a boy too young for war, of a bullet that stole everything. Sana didn't weep for him, didn't try to soothe him with empty words. She simply laid her hand on the scar at his wrist, a wordless, "I know." From that empathy, fear melted away and was replaced by trust. Not the kind born of survival alone, but the trust of equals, of companions who could lean on each other without shame. One morning, Wade opened the cabin door to find sunlight breaking through after long days of snow. The ridge shimmered white, but brighter now. Sana stepped out barefoot, her old wound still stiff but her posture straight. She drew in the cold air, exhaled, and looked at him with dark eyes alive in the light. "We survived," she said softly. Wade nodded. "Not just survived. We have each other." And in the wind that swept the pines, those words carried like a new hymn the beginning of a life neither of them had ever dared to imagine. Winter slipped away quietly, like a beaten enemy retreating into the hills. Ice melted from the cabin roof in thin rivulets dripping onto dark soil, newly revealed beneath the snow. Along the ridge, patches of green began to break through small shoots, stretching toward the sun. Spring had returned, and with it life itself stirred again. In the pale light of morning, Sana sat on the porch, her hands resting on her stomach. A faint smile touched her lips, a smile Wade had rarely seen. "I think it's begun," she murmured that day, her voice calm steady. Wade laid his rough hand against her waist, feeling the warmth beneath her skin, the subtle change already taking shape. His eyes held a light, not of shock, but of certainty. This was real, this was good. He nodded once and simply said, "Good." From that moment, the cabin no longer held just the two of them. It carried the quiet pulse of another life still hidden, but growing stronger each day. That heartbeat turned ordinary moments into something sacred. Wade set about building a new room on the side of the cabin. Fresh boards rang with the strike of his hammer pine sap still clinging sharp to the grain. His back ached. His palms blistered, but each swing was a promise their child would have a roof strong enough to weather any storm. Sana watched from the porch, her dark eyes following his work with quiet faith. She sewed cloth into small folds, as though already picturing the tiny form that would soon need them. One afternoon, Wade fitted the last beam into place. Sana approached, holding the wooden sign he had been carving at night. On it was a single word, Coulter. Plain, unadorned. No flowers, no scrolls. Just a name. She laid her palm against the rough wood, whispering softly, "Now I carry this name, too." There was no preacher, no paper license, no vows spoken before a crowd. But Sana had his name, and Wade had her. They had chosen each other, and that was enough. Spring stretched itself wide across the ridge. Pines whispered in the wind. Wildflowers bloomed bright along the creek bed. Sana planted beans, corn squash in neat rows, her hands sinking into the soil with a joy she hadn't known in years. Wade stood nearby watching her bend to her work, and something new swelled in him, something he'd never dared to claim before. Family. At dusk, they sat together on the porch, listening to the creek running fuller than ever with melted snow. Sana leaned against his shoulder, her voice barely more than a breath. "Do you think?" "If I hadn't fallen into your trap, we would have met." Wade was quiet then. Said if not the trap, then another time. We were bound to find each other. The words landed not like a dream, but like truth. For Sana, who had once been cast out as cursed, it was a revelation. She had not only been chosen, she had been loved. Their life together grew steady. Wade no longer woke each day with the dull weight of solitude. Sana no longer flinched at every knock on the door. Instead, they worked side by side, preparing for the child. One morning, Wade led her to the doorway, pointing to the mountain ridge wrapped in white clouds. "The world out there will never be gentle. But here, He gestured toward the new room where a small pine cradle already waited. "Here we have peace." Sana clasped his hand, smiling through tears. "Here we have family." And that is where the story has carried us, from a snare trap in the woods to the warmth of a firelit cabin, and now to a home waiting for a child's first cry. Friends, if you've followed the journey of Wade and Sana, you've felt what I have. They've walked from loneliness and pain into hope and happiness. Now I ask you, what do you think? Do they deserve this new beginning? If you believe in their love, leave your words of support in the comments. Hit follow so you don't miss what comes next, because this story isn't finished. A child is coming. A family is being built. A sign above the door bears a single name they now share. But will the harsh land let them keep their peace, or will new trials rise beyond the ridge, testing what they've built with their own hands? Tell us, what should Wade and Sana do next to protect their happiness? Your voice might just shape the next step in their story.